You're all still here. That's good. That's good news.
Scare him away.
I'm in a snarky mood. Anybody in a snarky mood? Oftentimes we do these dinners, the Atlantic hosts. We bring people from different areas, of a subject matter, and just to kind of liven it up and get everybody into the discussion. These can be about national security issues. It could be about education. Can be about new health therapies. And I'm looking at my friend Emily Octazandi here. I often ask the individual when they're going around and introducing themselves, who is the villain in this story? The Atlantic is the storytelling operation. So I'm always interested in who the bad guy is, or bad girl. And so I'm going to ask you, Steve, as we talk about value and pricing in this, who do you pin the tail on in terms of calling a villain in the story?
Yeah, so unfortunately in healthcare, the villain is actually all of us. Including you, the Atlantic. So what happens
snarkiness.
So if you think about it, the whole system is not working in the best interest of the patient.
Right.
It's become very financially driven, and so if you want to point blame, you can point it to everyone. So if you think about your HR department, they're addicted to those rebates. They want those rebate checks. If you look at the pharmaceutical manufacturers, they set the prices and often set it really high because they're trying to get some of that to stick to their ribs. If you look at the PBMs, obviously we're a for-profit entity also, so we're making something. The physicians aren't always prescribing the most efficacious product. Often they have financial interests. And so in my world, I believe we all share some of the blame in this.
So that's a great villain, everyone. Anyway, do you have a more precise villain, Leah?
No, I don't think I have a more precise villain, but I think what I would say is from a patient standpoint, we don't really care who the villain is. I think, our interest is in working with everyone that has an interest in supporting the health of, in our case, the psoriatic disease community. And so we're really less concerned with who the villain is and how we can partner to identify ways to improve the health of people with chronic disease.
Fair, unusual answer. Okay, Jamey?
Yeah, maybe it's your intent, Steve, but I think even the question feeds this zero-sum game adversarial position in the market that exists in healthcare today. So
is there not a zero-sum game adversarial?
I think we're moving toward a value-based, outcome-based marketplace where the various players in the value chain have to work together and partner, opposed to, pointing fingers at each other. So I agree with what's been said before. The system really encourages questions like that, adversarial positions across the value chain, and we need to move in a more collaborative way.
Eleanor, I know you've got a good villain.
I agree with everything my colleagues have said, but I do think we
tried for tension.
History, I think, is our villain here. We very often are doing things because it's the way we've always done them.
Right.
And we have not broken the mold, and we really do need to break the mold in many regards in order to get beyond this.
I think on the broad question, as we talk about, the changes that are coming in, and, I have spent a lot of time trying to understand the kind of value-based models that we're, considering and moving to, and how you actually make them work. I'm also just interested in just moving the needle on price care. And Steve, you and I were talking a little bit about this new cholesterol drug. And I don't want to create a feel-good situation for you, but I want to give you an opportunity to tell us how great you are in at least getting the prices down in some things, and walk us through it as if we were lay people. I mean, there are a lot of smart people from the industry, but with this $14,000 cholesterol drug that you were able to kind of take on, and how were you able to kind of segment the parts of this to get the price down for those users of it?
Yeah, so what Steve is referring to is the PCSK9s, a true breakthrough in the pharmaceutical industry. These are drugs that can bring your LDL, your bad cholesterol, down by 60–70%. And so for those patients at high risk for heart attacks and strokes, this is truly a remarkable product. But when it came to the market, it was $14,600. And at the time, there actually was no data that it did anything but lower your cholesterol. It didn't show that it decreased strokes or heart attacks, and we were, to be very frank, furious about the price. There's 71 million people in the United States that have high cholesterol, and if you just take the high-risk people, people who have already had strokes and heart attacks, that's about 15%. That's 10 million people. And so if every one of them were to go on the drug, we'd be costing the country about $140 billion on an annual basis. And so we worked with the pharmaceutical manufacturers. Over time, they came out with better data that showed that it actually did cut down strokes and heart attacks. And so we wanted people to have access. But remember, access and affordability go hand in hand. You make a drug really expensive, it's really hard for people to access it. And so we worked with Regeneron and Sanofi, and we came up with an idea where they would cut the price of the drug by over half. We obviously had to let patients get easier access to it, so we made the work for the cardiologist really easy. Just a 6-questionnaire to make sure it was the appropriate patient accessing the drug. But importantly for the patients, we gave a huge part of that back to the patient at the point of sale. So the actual price to the patient dropped dramatically. So it was good for patients. It still retained some rebate for the Atlantic HR department. So it was good for patients, good for payers, good for cardiologists, and hopefully it's going to be great for the system because we'll be seeing patients access the drug and have fewer heart attacks and strokes.
So Jamey, what's wrong as you look at it as the pharmaceutical in that? Do you think that's a strategy to get prices down overall, or do you think there are gaps and blind spots in what Steve just shared with us?
Well, I think in that example, the list price, didn't reflect the ultimate value, which is one of the challenges that pharmaceutical companies have in pricing their product in the first instance.
Right.
In this case, as Steve describes, the rebate revenue coming to Express Scripts is being distributed back to the patient. That's consistent with something we've been advocating for some time as the gross to net bubble has expanded, something like $158 billion in rebates and discounts in the industry last year, according to IQVIA. So at the end of the day, where we do share a common interest is patients being able to access in a reasonable way and afford, their medicines. But arguably, we have an inflexible system that doesn't allow for price changes over time as evidence develops. And that's essentially what's accommodated here.
So let me zero in on this. As we're talking about value models, as I understand it, value models are looking at the efficacy of drugs, efficacy of therapies, and looking at over time how these come back. And so if they're not efficacious, if they're not having the impacts, then people aren't paying for them. If they are, then you can do that. So my question is, in that world, are there becoming sort of dependable and relatively transparent pricing models that are working, and are you guys experimenting with them?
Yeah, I can start, but yeah, we work with a number of value assessment organizations in the U.S. and internationally.
Right.
No methodology is perfect. Some of the shortcomings tend to be they don't look at the value over time. As you know, the value of a molecule over time increases dramatically post-patent with the availability of generics where prices plummet. Often that is not considered in terms of a lifetime value of a new medicine innovated. But one thing as well that we'd like to have more of, and perhaps my colleagues will add, is more patient voice in the development of the medicines. We look at the clinical, economic, and humanistic attributes of any new medicine or vaccine that we
What does
develop.
that mean? Tell me. I mean, it sounds good, but what does that actually mean? But I know you're going to tell me. But when you're like the big bad pharmaceutical company,
Right. So
what do you mean by patient voice, and what do they give you?
To me, the humanistic contribution comes into play. We can quantify economically the cost of a hospitalization. It's more difficult to understand the impact on the individual and the families of serial hospitalizations. The value of a formulation improvement that allows for less dosing over time and the convenience that that ascribes to the patient. So these are all things that generally go minimized in these models.
So I think
Leah?
I think I can shed some light on that. So the psoriatic disease community psoriasis is a spectrum disease. So we've got folks with mild, moderate, severe disease. And in 2016, we sat down with the FDA as part of the patient-focused
So just to be clear, is pricing a problem with your members?
Yeah, I mean, access in general is a problem. Price is one piece of that. It's certainly a game of whack-a-mole. Price is just one issue. But our community spent the day with the FDA in 2016 talking about what frustrates them and challenges them. And despite the fact that there are many safe and effective therapies in our disease space, there's still a lot of patients that are not doing well. They're not treating appropriately to the level of their disease. And that's the same information that we shared with ICER when they did a psoriasis assessment and later that same year.
Tell us about that assessment.
Sure. So ICER looked at the 8 systemic therapies being used by patients with severe psoriasis. When they began the assessment, we reached out to say, hey, we've got a patient community and a patient perspective that we think you really need to incorporate in the conversation. We felt that that was critical, and if you look back, ICER's actually talked quite a bit about what they learned, both from talking to patients as well as the clinicians we introduced them to through that process. Ultimately, they moved from an initial finding of only one of the 8 therapies being of good value to all 8 at the conclusion. And further, they recommended that step therapy be abolished or limited in our space because they were all of good value. So from our perspective, because all patients don't respond the same way to all treatments, we would like to be in a place where the physician is really able to reach into their toolkit and pull out the most appropriate treatment for that patient. And so ensuring that they have that opportunity and the patient voice is a part of that process, I think, is really critical during these assessments.
Eleanor?
I think one of the things that we need to be sure that we clarify in this conversation is the difference between a value assessment.
Right.
And as Leah said, we really do want to see the patient voice reflected in those value assessments. It's very critical that a value assessment that might be done by an ICER or whatever group we're talking about, that they're including the outcomes in that assessment.
Right.
That are the outcomes that are important to patients. If we're focusing on some efficacy endpoint that's not of value to patients, then we've now created an entire value assessment that is trying to get to a fair price that's based on something patients don't care about. Those kinds of value assessments can be used as a backdrop for having discussions about value-based insurance design or value-based contracting, but those two things are not formally linked. And so from our perspective, yes, the value assessment must have patient centricity in it. They must have the voice of the patient reflected there, but value-based insurance design and value-based contracting also must have the voice of the patient involved, or again, you are going to set up for a target that's going to determine whether or not someone's going to get paid or how much they're going to get paid, and you may have chosen the wrong target.
So I've been reading, as best I can understand it, this National Health Council get ready checklist. This is one of your things, right? I can help you with the editing and writing of this, but you do have these things out, and I'm interested in them in the sense that as you're trying to tweak the system and
Everyone heard you say that.
Yeah, I know, perspectives, but as you're out there doing this, and I assume this is a new thing you're doing, so can you give us an example of working with the industry, how you've interacted, taking these patient-based groups and taking their checklists and improving the system? Can you kind of give me a story that helps me understand it better?
I think Leah is the best story. I mean, we have, for those of you who don't know the National Health Council, we're a multi-stakeholder membership organization. The large majority of our members are patient advocacy groups. A number of them are here today, and American Diabetes Association from the earlier panel is one, Leah's group, and there are others here. We make sure that our members have the tools and the knowledge that they need in order to be able to take on these challenges. So we don't do the disease-specific work, they do that, but we try to give them the
ecosystem then goes to the association, and then how do you interact with Express Scripts or another PBM or GSK or Pfizer or other firms?
I think a big part of it is just trying to identify what resources and tools and information you have at your disposal. So many patient groups like ours have been talking to their patient community for years and have a really good sense of what their community is challenged by and the perspectives that aren't often reflected in some of these measures. And so taking stock and really doing an assessment, a big part of the checklist is understanding what information you have at your disposal and then collating it in such a way that you can then talk to others about what's challenging your community. And so we do that on a regular basis. Our perspective is we want to engage with everybody. So we reach out and talk to payers. We've done roundtables with payers and PBMs and employers to bring folks to the table and say, is there a place here where there's common ground? Let us tell you a little bit about the changing state of psoriatic disease, and then let's talk about how we can together find ways to improve the health of this community.
Has President Trump's approach to drug prices helped or hurt you?
I don't know that any one policy change has really helped or hurt us in the last few years. I think in general this is a area that's gotten more challenging for patients. Just in the last 10 years, we hear from more and more folks calling into our patient navigation center talking about the fact that they're not on whatever is the most appropriate treatment for them. And for a chronic disease, that's critical. We know getting folks on treatment as early as possible will prevent future health issues and really irreversible damage. And so we want them to be able to have that conversation with their provider and then quickly get to a place where they're on.
Let me ask you the same thing, Steve, because as I understand you, when you're looking at rebates, and what I really liked about what you just shared is that you came up with a model that reduced prices, but everybody's sort of still got a piece of their the action, right? And some of what we see happening, and I don't know whether to judge it as constructive or unconstructive, but trying to push in advertisements the list price of a drug, right? So and that's part of the story today, right? So and that can be very pricey, and I guess it's part of the potential shaming or embarrassment strategy at some level, or looking and linking brands at certain levels, and you exist behind the brands. You're not a particularly well. I mean, Express Scripts is known, but you're not out there on the front face of these things. So what do you think is healthy and constructive in terms of those people who are really trying to push both transparency but also reduction that isn't happening today?
Yeah, so we agree with both those sentiments. That is, you got to have, the patient should know exactly what they're going to have to pay. So when you say that there's 8 different drugs for psoriasis, what's my copay going to be when I go to the pharmacy? And it's going to differ between one pharmacy and another. And so they should know exactly what that's going to be. The plan sponsor should know exactly what they're on the hook for. And so I believe there needs to be transparency. The transparency we don't want is we don't want our competitors to know. That is, if I'm negotiating against Jamey,
right,
and I have to tell him what another company has also bid,
right,
he's not going to bid it down any further than he has to. And so we don't want transparency where, because if you take gas stations, for instance, gas stations post the price right on the curb. And when was the last time you saw a price war between a gas station? And I'll guarantee you, Amoco buys better than the guy across the street. The reality is that transparency amongst competitors actually sets a floor on the price. It doesn't create a price dynamic that drives it down. Let me tell you what we did for psoriasis, for instance. So recognizing that there was these 8 products and they were all equal, we went back and we contracted with all 8 of them. We said, listen, you have to get, if a patient changes drugs, because the doctor doesn't know which drug is going to work the first time, and 25% of patients change in the first 90 days. If the patient changes for any reason, lack of clinical efficacy or side effects, you have to give back 2/3 of the money. And the pharmaceutical companies, to a company, agreed to do that because for that particular patient, it's an effective product. So the patient loves it because they can get easy access to any drug. The doctor loves it because they can use any drug in the toolbox. The pharmaceutical manufacturer likes it because we've gone on the hook to say we're going to drive adherence, so you're going to have higher adherence when we do this. And so net, it doesn't cost them as much to make that guarantee with us. And so we've been able to actually help patients, help doctors, and help the plan sponsors who are paying for it while keeping pharma in a good position. So there are solutions to these things. We just got to quit pointing the guns at each other and shooting each other. We got to start talking to each other and working through these problems, but it is solvable.
I want to go to the audience in just a moment, but before I do, Jamey, a lot of the critique that I've heard from the pharmaceutical industry about the pricing question and drama that we're seeing out there is that there's a misunderstanding about the R&D costs, about the uneven results that come out of investments, that the kind of ecosystem that a large pharmaceutical firm and the bets that a pharmaceutical firm makes. And a lot of people scoff at that. They laugh at that and they say you have so many other benefits that come from government and R&D and taxpayer dollars. But I just want to give you a chance to help us understand from a pharmaceutical firm how you manage pricing and return on what you're doing, and what are we doing in the media that you feel is unfair in reporting on this?
Well, I think one thing the media is slowly catching up to is this distance between list price. So focusing on new drugs approved in the list price versus the net price after rebates and discounts. But to your larger question on R&D investment, I know there are different views out there, but if you look at manufacturing-based categories or segments of industry, ours is among the most risk-laden industries. I think Commissioner Gottlieb explained that very well this morning. The cost of capital, the investment to bring a product to market, let alone assume the risk of all the failures, is inherent in the overall kind of population-based approach to pricing. What I'll say quickly, Steve, is we approach it early, as Steve mentioned, trying to integrate the clinical, economic, and humanistic benefits of a medicine. I think another thing in that the media gets wrong is the assumption that pharmaceutical companies just want to price at the highest possible list price. GSK, as an example, we've had roughly 6 or 7 approvals in the last several years. Most of those products were launched at parity or a discount on a list price basis to the prevailing therapy that we sought to replace. If you look at our last 3 approvals in 2017, we have a shingles vaccine that was recommended by ACIP. It's a 2-dose vaccine, $280 per series, a $60 premium to conventional therapy. And yet, CDC, ACIP recommended that as cost effective. The cost per quality was very attractive. We launched Juluca, the first 2-drug regimen in HIV, at a parity price. The only 2-drug regimen in a single tablet once a day, but at a parity price to allow for the broadest access and affordability versus what's on the market. And then we launched the first 3-in-1 inhaler at a significant list price discount. So the conventional wisdom that pharmaceutical companies just charge the highest price that the market will bear doesn't really bear out when you see the disciplined approach to value-based pricing in those 3 states.
So when you hear about hepatitis C costs, or you see some high cost thing, or you read about Martin Shkreli, does that give you a headache, or do you just say, I get it?
No, well, 2 different examples, I think, lumping touring.
Yeah, I did that on purpose.
Now, as a quick aside, GSK owns Daraprim in the UK and sells it for like 60 cents a day. Okay, compared to what it was charged in the US under touring. But relative to Sovaldi, I mean, arguably, from a cost effectiveness standpoint, some reports suggested that was a cost-effective price. What I don't think was accounted for was the immediate budget impact of roughly 3 million warehoused patients immediately seeking a cure. And so between cost-effectiveness and planning, which I think comes back to Steve's point about early dialogue, with government payers and private payers.
Because it's not all the little decent things you're talking about, parity pricing or whatever, that we're writing about. We're writing about flamboyant excess, right, or what appears that way.
No, I mean, if you want to comment on the state of care, I think it's a tale of 2 cities.
Right.
For many patients living with chronic disease, 9 out of 10 prescriptions at retail pharmacies are filled generically. Okay, so access, affordability. What's putting pressure in the system is all the innovation in the specialty categories, oncology, new biologics, treating diseases, migraine, PCSK9s, et cetera. But it's utilization, not price.
So we are going to go to the audience, but you used to be a Pfizer lady, so are you on his side, or where's he wrong?
It actually gets to what I said earlier, which is, we're still doing things the way we used to because that's the way we used to do it.
Right.
But we have all of these new therapies. So this is a great example of, the budget impact. We have no way of planning for that in advance, especially in Steve's position, this impact of this large number of people because of the way we've always financed the care on this annual, I've got my annual budget, as opposed to this benefit is going to be for a number of years, and can we start to think about how do we change the system to figure out how we absorb the high costs now, because some of these great benefits are coming for years to come, but we have no way to plan for that.
And to take that down to the patient level,
budgeting
level is terribly challenging because there isn't that transparency to understand what your copay is going to be, because it is based on list price.
And if your copay comes in January, you're going to pay that whole copay in January.
Right. Awesome, thank you. Do you have an awesome question?
I hope
okay,
so.
great. Rebecca.
Yes, so I work in the generics industry, and something that I hear a lot about is patient-centered care and then value-based care.
Right.
And I'm wondering about bridging the two so that we get the optimal value, even in the face of, I think, 30% or so of patients believe that the brand is superior to the generic. How do we kind of bridge that educational gap so that value means
bridging the
right
educational
thing?
gap?
Yeah, I mean,
Leah.
certainly we talk to a lot of patients about the importance of having that dialogue with their provider about what's going to be most appropriate for them. I think we're moving to a place where, with more options on the market, if providers are able to look at their toolbox and pick the most appropriate one and not just from the 1 or 2 or 3 that are on the formulary, I think that'll take us to a place where they're getting more personalized care.
Great. Yes, sir.
John Cummings, unaffiliated. Your comment about introducing new drugs at parity to the marketplace, I think it's a pretty way to look at it, but often when drugs are facing competition and knowing competition is coming, there's a dramatic increase in pricing before these new drugs come to the market.
Comments, Jamey, Steve?
I would just say, in general, sometimes the market actually is fairly good at figuring out what that value-based price point is. So in those occasions of launching at parity, that's generally in a purchase environment where that parity price has been accepted for the other product. We wouldn't launch at a parity price with a reference product that was poorly accessible or unaffordable. So in that sense, parity is proven in the market relative to the standard of care that's on the market.
But your point is actually well taken. If you take Gleevec, it came out at $25,000 a year. When it lost its patent, it was $125,000. No better drug, just a lot more expensive. So if the competitor wants to bring out a drug and they want to price it at $125, you're exactly right. The system's distorted. And so parity is not always the right way to look at it.
Steve, real quick, I mean, you shared with me a couple of positive stories on where you've succeeded. Have you ever gone after something and it just hasn't worked out? Like, give us a bad story.
Well, I'll give you an example. Hepatitis was a great example. Hepatitis came out, everyone's touting, and I'm a transplant kidney doctor. I've seen tons of hepatitis. It's a horrible disease. This is a cure. Comes out at $84,000. You got to use it with ribavirin, $140,000 per patient per cure.
Right.
And they thought this was parity. I said it was bullshit. And we actually fought them. And as you know, the price of treating hepatitis today is $20,000. And so the reality is they were inappropriately pricing it. We called it out. We actually started a price war. We actually guaranteed adherence with a cheaper product. And we were able to get the price of hepatitis treatment cheaper in the United States than in Europe. First time it's ever been done in a specialty product. But it took us 2 years to get there. And so we don't always succeed, at least often not in the early get-go.
This gentleman right here.
Hi, Mike Miller. I'm a policy physician, and one of the hats I wear is I'm the senior policy advisor for Healthy Women. And Steve, you started out by asking, who's the villains? And I want to make explicit, I think, what was implicit in a lot of discussion, that amongst everybody in the ecosystem, it's the patients who are not the villains. You might want to call them the victims or some other term.
Right.
But I wanted to ask each of the panelists if they could say the one thing they would do to really make things better for patients, giving them more of a voice, more of an equitable standing in this villainous war that we may be seeing right now.
What a perfect way to end this. I was going to ask them the question of what thing you would do, so thank you. Come back next time too, okay? Great.
Great question, yeah.
Eleanor.
So you didn't say it had to be feasible in the short term. You just said so the pie in the sky is that everyone truly understands what being patient-centered means, because we just see it labeled on everything. I'm patient-centered because I put the patient at the center of everything I do, which is not the definition of being patient-centered. So if people could, if all of the stakeholders in the healthcare ecosystem could truly understand what being patient-centered is and act on it, that could make an incredible difference.
Great. Jamey?
So I guess the counter to the patient is the disease is the villain. I mean, right? So that's what's driving up costs, et cetera. So tackling disease and enabling it in a system that maybe removes some of these financial mousetraps, these disincentives that have unintended consequences, stripping that away so that patients who need to be on therapy get therapy, can access and afford the therapy and stay on therapy. Adherence is still a major problem with
Thank you. Leah?
disease.
Yeah, I'd say everybody being willing to come to the table and have the conversation together with the patient there. We do a lot of talking about patients without actually including patients. So having the conversation with everybody, including the patient, to really work through the issues and try to find places where there's common ground so that improvements can be made.
Steve?
So agree with all those, but the one I'll add to it is we actually have to have tools for physicians and patients so they have true visibility to what their costs and choices are. So real-time benefit check at the doctor's office so they know the choices, what the co-pays are going to be, so they can work with the patient to actually give them the correct drug that they can afford. So,
And you know what, I would add, I mean, I want to thank everybody for the candor. It's a great question. All of you have had great questions. But the other thing I would tell you that, and I say this, you know, we're sitting in Washington. We've done a number of these forums, often some underwritten by pharma, but around the United States. And what I find to be a real problem that's not often discussed is sort of the literacy of the healthcare system. It's uneven around the United States, particularly when I look at things like cancer and others. You know, you go to Oklahoma, you go to a certain place, you know, well, I mean, you can name anywhere, but there's an unevenness in both the literacy of those that are practitioners, but there's also a question of access and literacy of those that are patients in the system. And the system is already confusing and opaque enough. So I hope we do work continually on, you know, the storytelling of this to make it easier for people. I want to really thank, this is a wonderful conversation. Eleanor Perfetto, Jamey Millar, Leah McCormick Howard, and Steve Millar. Thank you all very much.